Greetings all, and welcome back to A Traveler's Guide 2. Our examination of Zebeth was a long and thorough one, and we did the best we could to bring our simulation technology to the greatest tiers of accuracy for all here to enjoy. And we here at Science Team think that we did a pretty good job for our first time using it. And it's something that we will be improving upon constantly, as you will see in our next series of informational videos. And speaking of that, next up here, we are going to be taking a look into the aftermath at the end of Zebeth, and in turn, the events that occurred on the former vessel known as the Bottle Ship. As we begin with this segment, a traveler's guide to the Bottle Ship's main sector. Before we dive right into the main sector of the Bottle Ship, let's take a look at the vessel itself and a brief history of the events that have transpired there prior to its destruction with the help of some informational slides. The Bottle Ship was a seemingly derelict space station built and operated by the Galactic Federation for the purpose of creating and testing bioweapons based off a myriad array of creatures taken from many different planets, most of which still remain a secret in the files of Galactic Federation headquarters. At the time of its inception, the main goal of the Federation agents working here was to create a special forces unit modeled after the space pirates for militaristic purposes, with actual Zebesian space pirates being utilized and converted into cyborgs for this purpose. In order to regenerate and control the Zebesians via telepathy, the Galactic Federation needed to create a controlling body that was modeled after the infrastructure of Mother Brain, an entity that they simply called MB. Over time, the research staff considered the viability of cloning Metroids and came to the conclusion that much could be done with them, so they planned to use cell samples scraped off the Hunter's power suit during a routine checkup before she had to recalibrate her weapon systems in the empty training room nearby, and gave a formal announcement in the meeting room to the heads of the Federation about the destruction of all Metroids and Mother Brain to get the job done. However, they needed the first Metroid to recognize MB as his mother in order to control them. As such, MB had to take on the guise of a living creature, forcing the researchers to construct a cyborg body for her through which she could interact with the Metroids directly. The first infant to hatch was left unchanged and used as a control specimen, and in a stroke of pure luck, that infant Metroid went on to eventually reach a Queen Metroid stage, a welcome surprise for them to be sure. Over time, the Federation began to experiment on the Metroids and ultimately created the unfreezable Metroid in the process, but issues with MB started to increase at an accelerated pace at the same time. Potentially as a side effect of interacting with Metroids, MB, or Melissa Bergman, as she had been come to know by Madeline Bergman, the science development director of the facility, started to develop a distinct personality and emotions, and began arguing against the conceited humans she worked with, pushing her own opinions and ideas into their work. It was eventually decided that MB needed to be shut down and reprogrammed to keep her from becoming another Mother Brain, and Madeline could do nothing to help her. Feeling betrayed and hateful towards the selfish and uncaring humans she had been forced to live with, she ordered the Zebesian Special Forces and many of the station's other advanced bioweapons to rebel, sending the entire facility into disarray and destruction. Sealing herself in room MW, Madeline Bergman issued a distress signal in the hopes that someone would pick up on it. Although the Galactic Federation had already sent in the 7th Platoon to explore the facility and figure out what happened, the Hunter picked up on the baby's cry distress signal and found herself in the working company of the platoon, led by her former superior officer, Commander Adam Malkovich. Under the leadership of Commander Malkovich, the platoon and the Hunter were sent off to investigate what had happened to the ship, finding it completely full of life forms from many alien worlds and few that were very happy to see another creature in their habitat. The Bottle Ship was built to be, at least on the surface, an artificial haven for life forms by simulating their native habitats, but the rocks, dirt, and plant life existing there were the only things that were real. Features like the sky horizon details were all created with holograms, though obviously very good ones to fool even the smartest of beasts that had been transported onto the ship. In examining the facilities and the different biozones, however, the members of the platoon started to die off like flies, all of them seemingly by human forces. After restoring power to the main sector and entering Sector 1 to the ship, the platoon and the Hunter in particular were attacked by a mysterious creature near the corpse of a life form the researchers had come to know as Little Birdie. With the help of the 7th Platoon member Anthony Higgs, the monster was eventually driven off and the Hunter was sent to investigate it. The beast crashed into Sector 3 and she was forced to traverse the intensely hot area without her very suit functioning much of the time, and at the end, she was ordered by Commander Malkovich to explore Sector 2 in the search of survivors, which she found one of, but was unable to talk after being ambushed by a human controlling an FB-176 Feral Crusher. Eventually, the Hunter was redirected towards Sector 3 in order to hunt down the mysterious creatures from before, as its screams were causing all of the creatures in the ship to become extremely aggressive. This case culminated in her fighting the monster in its adult form, a clone of Ridley created by accident from the same material scraped off her suit that the Metroid cell samples came from. It would not be until after the near termination of the Ridley clone that the Hunter would meet up with the woman she had found before, again in the Bioweapon Research Center, and learn more about the darker origin points of the bottle ship, in particular about the SPST Special Forces Unit and Project Metroid Warriors and its propagation of Metroids for militaristic purposes. Moreover, the woman claimed that the head commander in charge of the project was none other than Adam Malkovich, which the Hunter did not initially believe. She rushed into the restricted Sector 0 in order to confront the Metroids head-on, with the ship's engines mysteriously turning on as she made her way into the sector, but she was taken out by Adam before she could actually enter the facility fully. Adam revealed that the Metroids would have killed her because they had been genetically modified into unfreezable Metroids that could not be reliably killed with any sort of weapon. Moreover, he admitted that he had written a document and explained the serious risks of using Metroids as weapons to the Galactic Federation, but it had been co-opted by a small internal group for their personal uses. With seemingly no options left in his eyes, Adam sealed himself in Sector 0, planning to utilize a self-destruct system put in place in case of an emergency to destroy all the Metroids contained within. Though it seems that a single Metroid did manage to get out, as a dead Gigafrog was observed by the Hunter in Sector 2 that clearly showed signs of Metroid predation. She begged Adam not to do this, but she was unable to change his opinion as he detached Sector 0 from the ship along with himself, falling out into the void of open space. After this, the Hunter returned to the Bioweapon Research Center once again and found there had been an additional survivor in Room MW, as first detected by her former commander. But before she can communicate with her adequately, she was forced to fight off the Queen Metroid that had been successfully developed in the facility, only the second to be known to ever exist. Though she nearly lost her life on several occasions, she caught a break when the edges of the ship stopped suddenly and flipped the beast onto its back, allowing the Hunter to damage its underbelly before using her grapple beam to force the creature into eating her as a morph ball, and then killing it by laying a power bomb inside of its sensitive stomach. In its destruction, the other survivor revealed herself to be the real Madeline Bergman. The false creature the Hunter had spoken to before was none other than MB, Mother Brain's effective duplicate in gynoid form. MB revealed her true intentions and stood by her stance against humankind. It had been her intention to collide the ship with Galactic Federation headquarters on Earth and unleash the monsters on board them out of revenge, and was thus the one responsible for turning on the engines of the craft. But for some reason, the engines to the ship had been turned off, and now there was nothing left but to destroy those who had wronged her and foiled her plans. As MB discharged a small amount of energy to blast off the hair clip that had been given to her by Madeline, a gift that had been given to her as a gesture of love as if she was her daughter, and prepared to fire at the Hunter, she was hit by an icy projectile and was surrounded by more soldiers from the Galactic Federation army that had apparently been sent to investigate in the stead of the Federation. But she was able to recover and fill the room with a number of bioweapons, including Desperakians. The Hunter was able to fight off the monsters for a while, but things ended abruptly when Madeline used a freeze gun on MB, and the army soldiers, under the orders of the Joint Colonel, shattered MB to pieces. In the conclusion of the event, it was revealed that Anthony Higgs had actually survived being attacked by the Ridley clone, and it was not only the individual who had shut off the ship's engines, but was still under duty to deliver the Hunter and Madeline to safety, much to the Colonel's chagrin, allowing the three of them to leave the ship together. Sometime later, though, the Hunter received word that the facility was going to be destroyed, but before that could happen, she had to retrieve a single object from the main deck. The item turned out to be Adam's helmet, and while she had to face off against many powerful monsters under control of Fantoon and then the Fiend himself, she made it out of the facility in time before it was completely obliterated. Nothing remained of the ship after that, but some of the creatures that had been stored on the ship would later make an appearance in the BSL research station after being collected by the Federation Army, though only to live to see the extermination of their kind completely by the X-Parasites. Now that we have the general history of the last known events to occur on the ship, it's time to start looking at its individual areas, starting with the main sector. The main sector served as a central hub of the bottle ship and connected to all of the sectors via the main elevator. Additionally, it was the housing space for the control bridge, bottle ship residential area, control room, and spaceport where the Hunter docked her ship. It was here that the Hunter first encountered Adam Malkovich and the rest of the 7th Platoon and helped them fight off the monstrous Brogue Mass after discovering a dead researcher in the same room the collective was living in. Afterwards, she was sent to find a way to get the power of the ship back online, and she was able to restore the main deck to full power in the system management room after fighting off a number of Rio enemies and destroying a pair of fly pods spawning them. Moreover, it was also here that the Hunter returned to after the initial destruction of MB and attempted to retrieve the only memento of Adam left behind, his helmet, but was forced to fight off the spectral monster Fantoon in the control bridge in order to get to it, and had to escape immediately afterwards as the ship began to self-destruct while she was still in it. With all of this now established, let's examine the creatures that could be found frequently within the main sector. The members of the Zoomer family are mollusks that are linked together by the shared scavenging habits and semi-shelled bodies. Gamers are an evolutionary offshoot of the zoomer family, and really distinguished by possessing only 3 eyes, much like silvers, and the possession of a much thicker carapace that makes them more resilient against attack. In fact, the variants exist on Brio and Talon 4 are completely invulnerable to most beam weapons, the only exception being the devastating space-powered plasma beam, while gamers that once fought in zebras were not quite as sturdy and had slightly different anatomy. These creatures have the same basic diet as the zoomer, but they keep their larger spines retracted most of the time in order to help them blend in with their surroundings. If a gamer is threatened, however, it will either ferociously attack its opponent or extend its full spines and pull its head into its armored carapace. In the latter state, these creatures are impossible to hurt with standard weapons, and only plasma-based weaponry and concussive weapons like missiles will be able to hurt them. Getting close to them at this point is usually a bad idea, as the spines are much larger than that of a zoomer and can be easy to jump into if one is not paying attention. This is especially the case with the ultra-rare orange gamers known as H-zoomers that are known to have existed on Zebes at one point, as they seem to have a habit of following around larger creatures as they moved near the gamer for reasons that are still unclear. It is also known that these creatures do not feed on soil or rocks, instead acting as scavengers that feed off dead tissue and other organic materials, which in turn makes them just as capable of spreading disease as the zoomer is. Despite this, in the more heavily armored forms in certain worlds, they are still usually not aggressive and easy to avoid as long as you watch your step, so they belong to threat level alpha alongside their zoomer relatives. The members of the Scree family belong to a group of bat-like insectoids that specialize in using their entire bodies to attack anything and everything that dare to get near them. Screes possess a thin, elongated main body with only a single pair of limbs, namely the small feet that allow them to roost from the ceilings of caves and corridors. Their heads were rather large for their body size and possessed a pair of compound eyes that allow the creatures to see even the darkest of environments. In addition, they possessed a pair of large wings that nearly covered the length of their body and were attached to the torso by a special band of exoskeleton material that could actually be rotated around a softer plate of tissue, giving these monsters the appearance of living drills. These beasts usually spent their time eating small insects from the air and did not bother anyone from afar. But if a target got too close to it and the Scree felt it was being threatened, it would swoop down from its perch while rotating its wings, turning its body into an organic drill. If the Scree missed its target, it might continue to drill into the ground in hope that it could dig a deep enough hole that its attacker would leave them alone, but if they felt that they were threatened beyond escape, they would instead fling rocks up for the drilling into the floor and purposefully break the exoskeleton apart to send shards of the material flying at nearby targets in the form of shrapnel. This latter option would kill the Scree in the process, but this was done for the good of its fellow brethren, as they tended to travel in groups and could thus be a pain to handle in large numbers. Thankfully, the exoskeleton material was fairly weak and easily damaged, and what damage they could deal through direct contact was fairly limited, so a few shots from a standard weapon was enough to dispatch them in most cases regardless, landing them in place within threat level alpha. The Rio family consisted of several insect-like creatures that were all genetically related and classified together as a result of the similar anatomies and behavioral patterns. The centerpiece of the family was the creature that gave it its namesake, the Rio, a fly-like beast that was known as more of a pain than an actual threat, though they could be a problem in large swarms. The normal version of these creatures possessed small wings that were just strong enough to allow it to flit about in the air rapidly. They were fairly simple-minded creatures and were easy to kill with any weapon when they were young, but older specimens tend to be more powerful and could withstand direct fire for at least a little bit. They mainly stuck to the roofs of caverns in their native environments and only swooped down to attack when they could detect the motion of other creatures nearby, but they could easily tear apart smaller creatures with their long claws, and they had a surprising reach as their arms were about the same length as their body. The adults tended to move with up and down zigzag movements in the air and could thus be quite easy to predict, but large swarms of younger specimens could be a nightmare to deal with, as they moved so fast that it was virtually impossible to track an individual with any reliable targeting system. Plus, they were more likely to simply try and grab a target to distract it, while the rest of the swarm devoured it. Thankfully, they were fairly weak in all their forms, and were therefore not a serious threat to armored soldiers. The fly pods that these creatures lived in could act as a means of protection and reproduction, and thus needed to be destroyed in order to fully exterminate these creatures from an area, but their fly pods are usually fairly sturdy and can only be destroyed with concussive weaponry or high-powered beam weapons like the wave and plasma beams. This shouldn't have made them much more of a terrible threat to explorers that are careful in how they approach them though, even if older specimens could prove to be a tad resilient to basic firepower, and thus have a deserving place within threat level beta. Bulls were an exotic form of plant life that resembled the members of the puffer family to a great degree, but they're thankfully nowhere near as potentially dangerous in their natural state. These plant creatures generated gases like methane and helium in order to keep themselves afloat in the air, but unlike the puffer and its relatives, their outer skin was normally very thick and could require heavy-duty firepower in order to break. Similar to the puffer, the bull possessed a series of tube-like ports around its body that are used to regulate the amount of light gas contained within its form at any time, allowing them to move up and down the air without having to exert much in the way of effort. However, the ports also served a secondary purpose that was much more important: food gathering. In the absence of sunlight, bullets had taken to using their tubular body form to suck in small organisms floating in the air or under the water, with a complex series of filtering structures existing in their interior body cavity that could quickly release a poison into the prey that killed them instantly, thus allowing the plant to then rip the prey apart and reduce it into a state the inside of its small body could then absorb. Despite the fragility of these internal structures, however, the bull was actually quite aggressive and would actively attempt to ram its hardened body into potential threats the moment they vacuumed air into their bodies that was extremely rich in active biological material. This power was not enough in the eyes of some, however, as the green-colored bulls were taken by the Galactic Federation on the bottle ship and converted into bioweapons by manipulating their genes to overexpress the place of the genetic code that regulated how much toxins they produced to kill minor prey, ultimately turning them blue color with purple tubes that could actively spit poison gas and genetically program them to ram targets solely to detonate their bodies in a toxic burst just like the puffer and its relatives, though this consequently weakened their skin and made them much more vulnerable to direct damage from all weapon types. This could make them a pain for many to deal with if the thick hides couldn't otherwise be readily penetrated, and given the noxious nature of the feeding cycle, it easily makes them fit for threat level beta and best avoided if at all possible. The members of the Sidehopper family were all alike in that they were insectoids that possessed a single pair of enlarged legs that are used for the purpose of locomotion and attack. The Sidehopper itself came in a variety of different sizes and colors, but they're all classified as the same creature as they had the exact same anatomy. The main body of the Sidehopper was adorned with a single massive pair of compound eyes that allowed it to effectively see everything around it in its environment, a small abdomen where the majority of its internal organs were stored, and twin pairs of sharp mandibles, with the Sidehopper being the only family member with more than one set, on the bottom of their body that they used to rip their prey apart. What really made these creatures stand out, however, was the disproportionately large legs, which had evolved in order to take advantage of the otherwise odd anatomy. Because their bodies were fixed as a single piece, and they could not move their mouths much, Sidehoppers evolved a single pair of massive legs, each with a knee joint that could be rotated 90 degrees from a horizontal to vertical state. The actual feet of the creatures were heavily armored and possessed elastic tissue on the inside adjacent to the base of their claws. This allowed these creatures to store massive amounts of kinetic energy in their feet that was then released when they jumped, causing them to soar high into the air before coming back down to the ground in a fearsome stomp that could potentially generate shockwaves capable of knocking over larger enemies and deliver enough of an impact to easily crush the bodies of both smaller critters, enabling the monsters to then feed on the scraps of their carcasses within range of their mouths. Thankfully, most of the younger specimens and the larger adults were weak to standard weapon fire and could not take too much in the way of punishment, especially if they were hit from above with overblasts. Nonetheless, these monsters could deliver a heck of a wallop with their powerful stomps and could deal serious damage to explorers if they didn't have strong armor suits for protection, and combined with their noble durability, it more than makes it perfect for classification within threat level beta. The Brug was a smaller purple insectoid that came from an unknown world and demonstrated a hive intelligence that rivaled that of some of the most dangerous insect monsters in the galaxy. The Brug itself was a fairly weak creature that fed on dead and decaying matter, eating the rotten putrid material that other scavengers couldn't even go near. The Brug could do this not only because it had a strong immune system, but also because of its strong stomach acids, which could quickly dissolve anything and everything they ate regardless of its cellular structure. These creatures usually had no way to really defend themselves and could be easy to kill with even basic weapon fire or insecticide, placing them squarely within threat level alpha, but the power these monsters have lays not in their own individual strength, but that of the collective hive they live within. The Emperor Brug was effectively both the king and queen of the Brug hive, developing from a rare Brug that had the right genes turned on to allow this stage of maturation in form and power to occur, and could self-fertilize itself in order to make more Brugs, though it tended to only do this when the numbers dipped low, as it had to feed on a large quantity of material in order to build up enough in the way of energy reserves to properly lay eggs. These creatures were easily differentiated from normal Brug, not only by their sheer size being more than twice the size of a normal Brug, and red in color, but also by the larger eye-like marking that was on their back. This image was not entirely functional on its own, but it did have a habit of scaring off predators and thus served the insects quite well defensively. These monsters could also take quite a bit more punishment than the lesser kin, but a single missile could still be enough to kill them instantly, leaving them in place alongside the normal brethren in threat level alpha. As has been made clear, the Emperor Brug and his fellow Brug were usually killed by basic fire from any weapon, so in order to make the most out of their power, an Emperor Brug would often release a powerful pheromone from its body when hungry or agitated that allowed them to form a link between their own body and the rest of the hive and essentially unify with the mass of its brethren, creating a huge legion known as the Brug Mass. This monster had a small holdfast on the base of its form, two long whip-like appendages in its upper body, and an enlarged central head and torso area, with the back of the Emperor Brug showing up at the top of the head like it was an actual eye. The Brug Mass itself was not that dangerous, but it could be very difficult to hurt, as the sheer number of Brugs in its form made it possible for it to take massive damage from attacks, only to repair the damage by inviting more Brugg outside the mass to join the fray. The collective would usually resort to lashing out with its tentacle appendages, either in a straight attack or side slam, or by merely whipping them around the mass in a circle, tripping up and slamming anything that was within its reach. The creature itself was invulnerable to damage, but direct fire at the exposed back of the Emperor Brugg, either from afar or up close with an overblast, could cause the mass as a whole to flinch and goad into performing a stab attack with its tentacles, or leaping into the air and slamming its whole head and torso structure on the floor if it lacked its appendages. In this state, it is possible to freeze its tentacles and the base attaching the frame to the holdfast. Once frozen, a missile could then be used to shatter the frozen appendage, severing it from the Brugg mass for some time. With this tactic, it was possible to remove the appendages and eventually the entire head structure of the monster, exposing the Emperor Brugg completely to attack. Once the Emperor had been killed, the rest of the collective would flee and would not return to its termination site until a replacement Emperor Brugg developed from all the remaining members of the Hive, thus removing the Brugg mass and its constituent parts from that area for a relatively long period of time. This mass might have had some surprising power to it, with sheer numbers on its side, but the fact that it was limited to fairly basic attack patterns could make it less of an issue to deal with if picked apart piece by piece, and thus best deserves a spot within threat level Gamma.
You see this shit too? Like, what the actual hell here? I don't mind little bugs when they're just little bugs, but this shit is ugly and icky as shit all in one. I don't even care if it isn't actually that hard to kill with the right weapons. The sheer sound of this thing moving around, a mass of thousands of insects gathered together in a hive mind. Ugh. Trust me, I ain't scared of these damn things, but I do not want to have to deal with them for any reason either. Besides, they don't exactly look like they've ever been edible, though if they were, hey, cool, free snack with every kill.
Cyborg Zebesians were the result of the Galactic Federation attempting to create a superior force of foot soldiers using the basic Zebesian life form as a base. As the name suggests, these creatures were no longer just living tissue, but cyborgs with metal armor that had been implanted directly into the exoskeleton-like hides, along with other crude pieces of technology being fused to various parts of them. It is unknown why these modifications are so crude relative to the advancement for space pirates have been making in their own bodies prior to the end of the Phase-On Crisis, but it is possible that the scientists responsible for the creation simply did not have much in the way of care towards how much agony they are putting the creatures through during the conversion process. The metal covering that protected their inner body could be blasted off with charged shots to weaken them, but the cybernetics made them more agile than normal Zebesians and, in addition to their normal organic beam weapons, some had their entire claws replaced and equipped with portable missile launchers specifically based on the Hunter's own arm cannon. These sprightly monsters could be very tenacious and understood how to use numbers to overcome their opposition, but at the same time they're more feral than intelligent and could be wrestled into uncomfortable positions to render them vulnerable to attack, especially if one used overblast strikes to take them down. Though getting close enough to them also carried the risk of getting close to where they could use their claws to simply bludgeon a target to death, and thus still gives them a solid place within threat level Gamma. Super Zebesians were the result of further bioengineering upon cyborg Zebesians, and were differentiated from their normal brethren by the red armor coloration and the possession of a supersized claw on one of their limbs. While these advanced soldiers behaved very similarly to other cyborg Zebesians and shared their same general weaknesses, they had the ability to fire several shots out of the arm cannons at once and, if they needed to, could use their large claw to power up and fire a massive laser attack built to mimic the properties of the wave beam, allowing them to blast through thin surfaces with little trouble and thus making them a serious threat outside of them simply being capable of taking more damage before falling. Coupled with their stronger armor plating, it clearly gives them a place within threat level Gamma, though at a higher class within said ranking to reflect the stronger weaponry and armaments at their disposal.
It is more than shameful to see this. See what my clan has been reduced to, turned into nothing more than puppets for the Federation. On the one hand, it was a fitting end in all admittance, but it's still hard to see this. I could have ended up just like them, controlled like an animal. I know most of the Galactic Federation works for the good of people, but this just doesn't feel right in any way to me. I know that it's a moot point, but I fear there may be others out there suffering in some sort of stasis or experimentation. Or worse. I must keep note of all of this. I cannot let this suffering be forgotten with the rest of our culture.
The Galmanian was a rare reptilian creature of unknown origin that seemed to have undergone at least some degree of bioengineering in order to make it a more efficient weapon than it might otherwise have been. These creatures resembled Earth chameleons a great deal, and shared with them the power to change the color of their bodies in an instant, though in the case of the Galmanian, this power could be taken to the extreme allowing them to completely and utterly vanish from the visible spectrum. Aside from possessing the characteristic eye shape of their lookalikes and a bright purple body coloration, these creatures also possess massively long tails that could be worked as a prehensile limb to grab and attack other creatures in the way of the beast. Normally these creatures only fed on insects to survive, but tyranny by the Galactic Federation had turned those present on the battleship into voracious predators that would attack anything and everything that dared to show their face to them, even if they were not willing to show themselves at the start of a conflict. In nearly all cases, the Galmanian would wait in the shadows, hidden from view, and sneak up on its targets from behind or from the side. Once it was close enough, it would spin a trio of acid globs their way in order to harm and damage their prey, hopefully disabling them from that point. From there, these entities would then lash out with their tails from afar and try and strangle their target, otherwise just fling them around until they've been put out of commission. If a close quarter strike was needed, they may have even lashed out with their tongue or simply headbutted their target. Interestingly enough, these creatures had been observed with a claw-like extension at the end of their tongue that was definitely not natural. This, combined with the green armor that seemed to abnormally affix to their outer scales, suggests these creatures had certainly been bred to be bioweapons and had been unnaturally modified to bring out these aspects more. As long as the Galmanian was invisible, there was no real way to auto-target it with a beam weapon. A missile, however, could still be used to lock onto its heat signature and fire, and the resulting blast would stun them enough to temporarily disable the ability to hide from sight. Moreover, if one was quick enough, it was possible to perform a lethal strike on them while they were stunned by blasting a charged shot straight down their gullets. If this is not possible, however, a pair of overcharged attacks could easily finish them off, or another lethal strike could be attempted by precisely grabbing their tail and throwing them to the ground to stun them for a short period of time. Even if it could be possible to track them, their preference for evasive tactics and hidden assaults could make them incredibly hard to handle and difficult to take down with conventional firepower if the sneak attacks couldn't be blocked, and thus have a fitting place within threat level Gamma.
A very curious beast here, I have to say. It was a brilliant move to weaponize this sort of beast for stealth operations, or at least I would assume this was the case for its unique combat attributes. However, I do have to remark that the projectile attacks seem to have a habit of giving away their position to well-armed opponents, so that is a bit of an issue, but we all can't be perfect. That said, I would love to get my hands on one of these beasts someday, if ever possible. There may be a chance to make better use of its clothing attributes for defensive attributes, as the old cloaking devices used by former space park clans have proven to be more than a bit inadequate.
The Chiratian was an amphibious lifeform that had been severely altered for the sake of making them into effective amphibious bioweapons aboard the bottle ship. In their normal form, these entities were purple, frog-like humanoids that mainly fed on small insects and the occasional edible mushroom, as they normally liked to live in swamp areas where they could live a fairly simple life and hide beneath the surface of murky water pools to remain out of sight of hunters. However, experimentation by the Galactic Federation had turned these creatures into walking power plants, as their bodies had been equipped with an advanced cybernetic suit that is fully integrated into the nervous system and thus was under their full control, additionally helping to insulate them against cold temperatures and purposefully heightening their aggression so much that they were almost impossible to control without extreme electroshock therapy. In terms of physical attacks, the Chiratian was an agile and deceptively durable creature that could flip its body around with ease and either strike nearby opponents with the arm-like extensions on its cybernetic attachment pack, or perform a nasty kick that could deal incredible damage and knock a target off its feet in a split second. They are also able to use these moves to do more than just deliver melee strikes though, as the Chiratian was able to use its rubbery skin and attachment pack to reflect charged beam shots from its body and thus making it a pain to deal with from afar. In addition, the Chiratian was able to use the arms of the attachment pack that are biologically welded onto it to fire purple orbs of electricity as a projectile attack, but this attack could easily be stopped with a charged plasma weapon like the Ice Beam, as it would form a frozen plug on the outside of the arm's launching port. This could shut down their attacks for a short period of time, but once this was done, a Chiratian would quickly enter an agitated state and overcharge its body with power, causing it to begin coursing with orange electrical sparks and effectively make it completely immune to all beam weapons. Only the concussive force of the missile was capable of knocking it out of the hyperactive state. Getting near these creatures while this electrical shield was up was a bad idea, as mere contact could electrocute a target, and the Chiratian became capable of leaping high into the air and either firing a massive ball of electricity to attack, or generate one and then try to forcefully slam it into its target for both melee and electrical damage. All of these skills and attributes serve to make the Chiratian an extremely dangerous monster to face, and it could be especially frustrating to face more than one of them at a time, but overblast attacks could still be used to deal damage to them if one was agile enough, and they could be quickly terminated if one could strike them with a point-blank charge shot, as it would knock them on their feet and grant their attacker the chance to rush over and deliver a charged beam blast straight to the skull in a lethal strike. Nonetheless, the sheer power that these monsters could unleash with their extreme flexibility and electrified forms was not to be underestimated, and easily gives them a place within threat level Gamma.
Gotta respect these ugly buggers for their quick movements and fancy footwork, and the potent weapons that they've equipped with could have made them a hell of a force to be reckoned with in close quarters. Kinda funny to see something that partially lifted water to have such conductive power to them, but I guess that's par for the course when it comes to the shit the Federation could put out on the bottle ship. Can't imagine that those suits attached to them are comfortable to them, though, given it looks like they've been plugged right into their bones and other body parts. Kinda makes me glad this shit I've got is removable. Don't think I'd handle the voltage well otherwise.
The Asborian was an armored arthropod that was brought upon the bottle ship for experimentation to develop its capabilities as a bioweapon. And while not much had been done to seriously change the species, its incredibly aggressive nature and considerable physical strength nonetheless made it a vital threat to an explorer who wasn't able to take advantage of its reproductive needs in order to defeat it. In their natural state, these creatures can actually grow a thick, tough exoskeletal shell that is effectively impervious to all types of attack and grant them an appearance strikingly similar to the earth-based horseshoe crab. In this state, these creatures would attach themselves to metallic coils using an electromagnetic organ on their undersides, introduced through genetic tampering by the Galactic Federation, and waited for potential prey item to come near them, at which point they would spring into action and start to attack with their large bladed claws. They didn't have much in the way of reach with these claws, but this suited the Asborian just fine, as they preferred to instead rapidly move around the floor with their body flat on the ground, ramming into anything and everything that got in their way. During this attack, these creatures would additionally reproduce larvae from their bodies that looked just like them but are otherwise much smaller, coming in groups and were biologically designed to detonate as a defensive tactic whenever they came across creatures larger than themselves, much like their original parents. This didn't help the Asborian population numbers too much, but their design as a bioweapon rendered this a bit of a moot point. The Asborian was incredibly difficult to hurt in this state and essentially impervious to direct attack, but there were two major ways to harm it. First of all, whenever they went for a forward lunging strike, these creatures would lift up their bodies just far enough to reveal the electromagnetic organ that helped them stick to walls and glide over surfaces like they were swimming. A direct shot to this organ would cause electrical feedback that could harm the creature and possibly set it up for a counterattack. Secondly, and most importantly, the Asborian could be defeated by literally ripping it out of its entire body. These creatures were distinct from other life forms because they are unable to normally produce offspring with their bulky shells. As such, in order to mate, these creatures would have to literally leave their shells and reveal their true physical form, a semi-large worm with vicious little mouthparts and not much else going for them. The sex organs of these creatures were kept in their tails, which are normally plugged deeply into the shell to keep them protected. By fertilizing them externally, these entities could ensure that a greater number of offspring would be properly fertilized before the female returned to its shell and relied on it to keep its developing eggs safe, only releasing them when they are fully matured or as living bombs if forced to defend itself against a predator of some sort, as already noted. In most cases, these creatures were cemented strongly in their shell and could use electrical pulses to control their limbs exceptionally well, but a strong physical force could still be enough to rip them from their place. As such, when these creatures were sliding along the ground, they would occasionally stick out a large portion of their core worm body that could be struck with a charged beam shot to deal damage. Eventually, Asborians would lose their stamina and would slump over in a dazed state. Performing a lethal strike on the monster would not kill them, but it would rip out their worm bodies and thus make them vulnerable to attack and forced to resort to a desperate attack. In their unprotected state, these monsters had little in the way of real offense on the side, as the only thing they could do is wrap around targets and detonate violently. It is thought this was a defense mechanism employed by these creatures for the sake of the large colonies they were known to be living in their native lands, as the explosion was usually enough to kill their attacker and thus make it easier for the rest of their kind. However, in this form, these monsters were extremely vulnerable to attack, and especially the cold, as they preferred to live in high temperature areas, so a single charged shot from a weapon like the Ice Beam could freeze and kill them almost instantly. Despite these shortcomings though, the Asborian was a powerful creature that could not be harmed like most bioweapons, so caution was highly recommended. They might not have had much in the way of offense once they had been rendered vulnerable, but unless one had extremely agile reflexes to work with, it is unlikely that most would get the chance to actually inflict pain on these monsters before they ram their opponent into submission and allow their infants to feast on whatever was left of said opponent, dead or alive, giving them a proper place within threat level Gamma.
The other one, this guy did it a lot, but the other one, they just wants problems makes him keep it. Same time, this kind of badass. They can run, swim, slice and dice. They have to repeat some downs even pretty easy to manage in a lot of cases. Of course, making kids can be a problem first, but once they got what they need, they can just go off and make some many kids they like on their own. Kind of will see him using the offspring of weapons and send spells that makes it a little hard to keep the population episode. Especially if you're quicker than nice and relatively will be cutting your rooms in no time.
The Radogian was one of the most powerful bioweapons to ever be produced by the Galactic Federation, and was a devastating creature that even the most advanced of fighters may be incapable of consistently harming, let alone defeating. The Radogian resembled the genus Anomalocaris and possessed a large, heavily armored segmented body with undulating structures adorning the side of its form, as well as two extremely large raptorial appendages and circular, blade-like mouthparts. However, These are the only parts of the Radogian that were natural, as the rest of its form had been completely replaced with cybernetics and artificial weapon systems, usually integrated into the creature shortly after birth so it would grow with them and adapt to them as they were replaced and rebuilt until the monster was at its full adult size. The Radogian stood on a pair of modified lower limbs, but they were rarely ever used that much, as they preferred to move around using the other set of lower appendages, which were attached to the main body with bioengineered tissue that had the durability of titanium but the flexibility of rubber. These limbs were what made Radogians a serious threat, as they could not only use their arms to swipe at opponents in rapid left-to-right combos, but were also their prime source of evasion, as they could use their sharp claws to cling just about any surface and rocket towards it, quickly dodging any and all weapon fire directed at them. Their uncanny talent in effectively utilizing this maneuver was the product of both natural anatomy and quick reflexes, which are primarily the result of training and modifications made by the Galactic Federation to the creature's already advanced compound eyes to grant them the best motion tracking abilities observed in any bioweapon produced by them to date. Thankfully for the Radogian though, its primary raptorial appendages were not completely useless, as they could use them to grab opponents and slam them into the ground to deal immense damage, though freezing these appendages and then destroying them with a lethal strike could completely remove the attack from the repertoire until they had the chance to regenerate these limbs. Because they moved so fast and with such great precision, the only time the Radogian could really be hurt is if it was attacked while using an attack of its own or immediately afterwards, making any sort of wild shooting and carefree aim a risky proposition. In addition to this, the creature was also equipped with jet propulsion drives in its lower body that allowed it to fly and ravage other creatures forcefully, which is further complemented by a seeker missile launcher system stored immediately adjacent to these jets, granting them the capacity to fire these lethal rounds in the air where they could not be easily hurt. Lastly, it is known that these monsters had a particle laser system installed in the inside of their mouths, so if they raised their bodies up fully, they could fire a powerful fast-firing purple laser that can cut right through weak armor with little trouble. The wind-up for this attack could generally be quite quick and almost impossible to counteract, but every once in a while, the mouth parts of the creature may have glowed red while the beast would start sucking in air. This was designed to allow their internal system to cool off before firing another laser so they didn't have to hurt themselves from the attack, further emphasizing the artificial nature of most of their weapons. At that point, they were actually vulnerable to attack, for if a missile was fired into their mouths, it would stun them for a few moments and thus leave open to attack, though they would recover fairly quickly regardless. In short, the Radogian was an extremely powerful monster that could absorb an incredible amount of damage before falling, and was thus incredibly hard to destroy. And while extreme persistence and quick reflexes could potentially conquer them and either kill them or force them into retreat to recover their energy, they were nonetheless among the most effective bioweapons ever developed by the Galactic Federation, and have more than earned a spot within threat level Delta.
As much as I hate the Galactic Federation with a certain passion, I must admit that when it comes to creating effective bioweapons, they have produced some of the finest examples I have ever witnessed, and this is a perfect example of just that. Aside from having a weak spot in the form of their mouth area, which, to be honest, isn't exactly something that I could see as anything easy to cover in this instance, this creature was heavily armored, incredibly agile, and had the capacity to generate actual missiles from its body naturally, a trait that echoed the energy blasters that troopers have, but at a much more impressive power level. The sheer maneuverability of this creature was astounding for its size, using its elastic limbs to both attack and move about quite quickly, not to mention being able to fly, for heaven's sakes. They really did think of so much with this one. Bravo to the Federation for once. They might all be gone now, but I have a feeling that their blueprints are still out there somewhere, primed for the taking.
The true origins of Phantoon are still an utter mystery, and its ability to seemingly shift in and out of reality more than troubles those that are aware of its presence, but its true motives and goals are even bigger mysteries that have yet to be answered completely. It is said by some that Phantoon itself was a ghost created from the sheer misery and longing of the spirits contained in the wrecked ship of Zebus to move on, but this is bogus information and does not accurately reflect the abilities of the monster. In truth, it is more likely that Phantoon was a stowaway on the wrecked ship when it was still operational and lived there among the Chozo for an unknown amount of time. Since it is not known where the first Chozo settlers of the planet Zebus actually came from, the homeworld origin of this phantasm is equally uncertain. What is certain, however, was that Phantoon took over the wrecked ship once it had been completely abandoned by its crew and was drawing power from it when it was originally confronted by the Hunter. The entity was defeated by the Hunter on Zebus and was thought to have been destroyed, as its dying screams were followed by its form completely warping and deteriorating into a veil of nothingness. But this would not be the last time the Fiend would make an appearance. After the MB incident on the bottle ship took place, the Hunter went back to the main communications room of the station to retrieve the helmet of former Commander Adam Malkovich, but on her way, Phantoon appeared out of nowhere and started to attack the ship. The monster had apparently used its extrasensory powers to take control of some of the stronger enemies in the station and use them to try and kill her and prevent her from reaching the bottle ship control room. But when they failed to do the job, the spectral entity confronted her directly in the control bridge and tried to kill the hunter once again, using powered-up attacks from before to overwhelm her. Despite its efforts, however, the hunter was able to deal critical damage to the monster's eye and send her hurtling back into space, where it exploded in a brilliant flash of color and faded from the physical realm completely, leaving its ultimate fate unknown once again. In terms of physical structures, Phantoon's body form made very little sense anatomically, but that may have only been because no one was able to see the whole picture. The monster was comprised of a large bulbous head with brightly colored crystal-like patches of material and a crestline running down its form that gave it a flower bulb-like appearance, as well as a neck-like plated structure at the bottom of its form with spikes adoring the rim, a pair of large spikes projecting out and downwards from the base of its head, a pair of thin unadoring tentacles, and a single massive eye attached to an extendable cord that was housed in what looked to be a double set of open, toothy maws. It is unknown if this was in fact the entire body of Phantoon or merely a piece of it, its remaining form potentially shrouded in a realm that the human eye was simply not meant to see. Phantoon was able to shift in and out of the physical world at will, and could even hide himself completely for short periods of time. On the one hand, this might suggest that he truly was a ghost, but it is known that he could be made vulnerable to attack if struck while his eye was open. This instead supports the possibility that Phantoon may in fact have been a multidimensional creature and had only a small part of his body exposed to attack at any given time, its invulnerability then being attributed to simply retreating to another plane of existence while ready to another attack. As noted already, though the hunter was able to defeat the creature and restore power to the wrecked ship in defeating it, its appearance on the bottle ship was even more menacing than before. While Phantoon seemed to have lost or merely chose not to engage in extra-dimensional activity like before, its tolerance for pain had increased dramatically and it brought with it a few new tricks as well. Aside from an improved, more directly streamed variation of its Phantom Eyes attack, Phantoon was much more physical this time and used its tentacles to break the outer glass of the control bridge and expose the hunter to the vacuum of space, which she was protected against with the power of her gravity suit, just to have a better chance of knocking her off into the void with a tentacle lashing. Phantoon also gained the ability to generate dark pearls on the ground that can deal critical damage to anything foolish enough to step in them, as well as Rage Hands, strange hand-shaped enemies made from Phantoon's spectral powers that would try to grab the hunter and slam her into the ground. Amidst all this turmoil though, she was able to slowly chip away the creature's health until it slumped over its eye on the ground. A lethal strike to its damaged eye ultimately destabilized its form and caused it to float back into space again before vanishing in a colorful but violent explosion, granting the hunter access to the last item she needed to retrieve before the bottle ship was destroyed. While it can be said that Phantoon had been best in the physical realm humans live in and seemingly died outside the bottle ship, its multi-dimensional state nonetheless raises concern on the validity of such a conclusion and raises the question of whether or not the entity is actually gone, a question whose answer only time will tell, and thus lays it with an appropriate rating within threat level Epsilon. Since it basically acted as the hub area that connected all the different locations that could be found on the bottle ship, it should come as no surprise that the main sector was also among the safest of them all to traverse, and really easy to make a trip through without feeling too endangered. That isn't to say, though, that there weren't any creatures here to be concerned with, far from it in fact. However, what entities were known to reside here for the most part were rather weak and not something that most explorers would have to worry about too extensively, save for the few creatures that could prove to be a terrible experience to encounter. As such, while it was still active, this place was where most of the human inhabitants of the bottle ship would call home, and was more than worth relaxing in if one had the time to do so. Even though it may have been the prime spot that most would get to experience if they chose to explore the reaches of the bottle ship without much supervision, this is again also the only place where one could access all of the other locations in the ship's habitation zones relatively safely. So next up, get your blades and blasters ready for a tropical rendezvous as we take a look at the tropical and forested land known as Sector 1, the Biosphere. Thank you all for watching this video. We here at Space Pirate Science Team take our work very seriously, and we genuinely wish to be as informative as possible when it comes to the work we conduct here, for both ourselves and in the name of science. If you enjoyed this video, please like, subscribe, and comment to help us get greater recognition out there to inform the greater populace of the universe as a whole. Also, feel free to keep track of us through Twitter, as we'll be posting notices there every time something new is submitted for your viewing pleasure. We hope to see you all in the next video, no matter what world it may take us to.